story of Upbuild began in a monastery. On our quest to understand ourselves more deeply, we recognize that it is our attachment to our egos, our identities, that gets in the way of being our true selves. This podcast will help you understand your ego. It will help you better understand your inner world, the motivations, insecurities, and emotions that affect your every action and relationship. Welcome to Upbuilding the Self.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Upbuilding the Self. I am Michael Sloyer, and I am here with my partners, Prasada and Rasanath.
Hey, Michael.
Hello.
Hey, guys. I was thinking earlier today before we were recording that I enjoy each of your company so much, and it's such a privilege to be recording this episode with you.
I feel the same. I feel exactly the same. Thank you.
Right back at you.
Beautiful. So today our topic is an existential crisis is an opportunity for growth. And I am particularly excited. There are many reasons why I'm excited to talk to you two about this topic, but I think one of the main reasons is because when we first met, which was back in 2011, and actually the reason we first met was because I myself was going through an existential crisis at that time. I didn't exactly know what an existential crisis was, but I knew I was feeling it. And it was one of the reasons that I came to that monastery and that I sought both of you out in the first place. So it feels very much like a full circle to be having this conversation today. For our discussion, I mean, there's a lot of different ways that we can go, but just to introduce the line that we're using as our title for the episode, an existential crisis is an opportunity for growth. This is a line that you use to title one of the lessons that you teach within a course on the Bhagavad Gita, one of the first lessons in that course. This course has had various names over the years. It's now called The Call to Awaken. So I was wondering if you could get us started by sharing what is an existential crisis and why did you name the first lesson of that course with this line, an existential crisis is an opportunity for growth?
Yeah. So actually the session is titled Checkmate, the Yoga of Existential Crisis. And the meaning of that is what we really want to take away as the main point is how, as you said, it's an opportunity for growth. So we emphasize that again and again and again. And we talk about in the course how we want you to be able to wake up in the middle of the night and have that ringing through your mind. That's how crucial this lesson is. Existential crisis is an opportunity for growth. So what is existential crisis? It is an experience of my own existence being called into question. That's a crisis when my existence is turned upside down. I question who I am and why I'm here, what I'm doing. That is a crisis. It's a crisis on the level of the highest rung. There's nothing more core and more of a shakeup than questioning our very existence.
What would bring about an existential crisis?
I think several life events can bring about an existential crisis. The loss of a job, the loss of a loved one, you being asked to do public speaking for the first time, the loss of freedom when you have a new child. All of that can create the feeling of an existential crisis. And something has been interrupted, something has been disrupted when you experience an existential crisis. There is a certain flow of life that suddenly is brought into question. And I find myself on a different terrain in trying to normalize it again. We had a collective existential crisis. We have had a collective existential crisis in the last 3 years when the pandemic hit. It changed the nature of how we thought about life. So I can think about infinite varieties of existential crisis, ways in which an existential crisis can arise. Some of them are more general, more collective, more understandable perhaps, more relatable perhaps, because there are common experiences like the loss of a loved one, our own death, or a chronic sickness, that we realize we'll have to carry for the rest of our life. And some of them are much more customized. They are specifically made for an individual that somebody else, when they go through a similar experience, will not necessarily think about it as an existential crisis.
But make no mistake, those incidents that cause a crisis that we associate with existential crises, they're not the real existential crisis. Those are the triggers of what is actually a crisis on the level of our existence.
Okay. You just dropped something huge. So I think more needs to be said around that. Those are not the real, because when Rasanath was talking, first of all the examples that you shared, Rasanath, were so relatable. And I really appreciate this point around, like, there are classic things like sickness or thinking about our own death, which, everyone knows to be as triggers for existential crisis. But then there's also something like public speaking, where the fear and the intensity of thinking about needing to do something like that, if that's one of our fears, or if that's something that gives us some pause and some concern, that can also trigger an existential crisis. And I've experienced the range of those with many different triggers. So Hari, please, you shared this big bomb here that those aren't actually existential crises. They're just the triggers for them.
Yeah, they get us in touch with the only real existential crisis that exists, which is that I am going to die and I don't want to die. So the real existential crisis, and Ernest Becker brings this out beautifully in his book, The Denial of Death, which was a seminal work that really changed our psychological understanding collectively for those who are familiar. We are all in a constant denial of death. Constant. It never ceases. There's never an off button for that denial, which means there's never an off button for the fact that I'm afraid, terrified of my death. And that may be the pain of death. It may be the pain of non-existence, which I think is even deeper. And it's something which is unimaginable for us who have life. What does it even mean? How can you conceive of not having life anymore? It's not possible for the mind to actually grasp. We can speak about it intellectually, but we'll never, ever understand what to speak of emotionally reconcile with what that is. It's impossible. No matter how hard we try, no matter how intelligently or impressively we speak about it, it will never do justice. So the existential crisis that's at the heart of everything, which every one of these individual crises points to, is the fear of death. And the denial of death is my coping mechanism. It's my compensation and my trying to experience more and more of a rich life and happiness in this life is actually not coming from the positive place that we would love to think that it is and that we often claim that it is. It's actually coming, as Becker points out, as a compensation for my fear of death. It's all coming from that place. And the wisdom of the Bhagavad Gita and the wisdom of all different spiritual traditions will tell you that this is the case, including Buddhism, which is an outgrowth of the early Indian Vedic culture from which the Bhagavad Gita comes to us, that really everything is this compensation for the fear of death. That's the existential crisis.
And what would you say to someone who still feels like they're experiencing an existential crisis, but might be in their 20s and they're having a great time and I'm not scared of death. Death is so far away that this is not something that's affecting me right now.
How can you be so unafraid? How do you know? You're not guaranteed even another moment, what to speak of another day or year. And we see this all around us. I mean, there's no way that you can debate it. And the fact that we come out feeling our youthfulness and our invincibility, that's classic compensation for the fear of death. That is exactly the inability to acknowledge the fact that I have no idea whether I'm going to be here another moment or not, and whether I will have any physical strength or wherewithal in another moment or not. And that I see people are dying all the time. And I'm just playing a gamble for like, well, not me. It's not going to be me.
It's such a good question, because when I reflect back to my own time when I was in my early 20s, the world is your oyster, right? There is a way in which you experience the exuberance of youth that many times gives the illusion of eternality, that this is how life is going to be. And I finally arrived. I was waiting for this moment that this is how life is. Now it's only going to be up from here. Right? So that's one illusion. The other illusion that arises is, sort of an opposite of that, which is, well, I have gotten to this place. I only have a limited time, and so I have to make the most use of it. Right? So it's the illusion of abundance and the illusion of scarcity. that both simultaneously make us cope for that, the true feeling of the existential crisis that Hari Prasad was talking about. Why that, if you pause for a moment and really think about, why would I do all of these things when at a certain time they will, by the force of time, be taken away? There's not one thing that has lasted the force of time. So if I were to step back and really think about, well, why am I doing this? The answer is just very simple. I want to eternally leave my mark in some way. I want to prove to myself that I am something. And then somebody else, it's somehow like somebody that people will remember me forever because I did this. There is always some version of leaving a legacy, as Ernest Becker very poignantly puts. He says that we are all engaged in our immortality projects. I think the coining of that term it captures everything. And I think what this calls for is to step back and really look at, where is this leading me to? And you know what? It's scary to look at it, because we may come to the conclusion that I'm putting my time and energy into something that will never necessarily give me what I'm truly seeking. But it takes honesty. It takes honesty to understand, to confess that, it is true. I'm investing in things that are impermanent anyways. So what should I be doing? It's a very scary question to ask.
Laid out this paradox beautifully of the abundance and the scarcity, and the fact that we can act in the same compensatory way for this denial of death on both sides. And what strikes me is that can happen simultaneously, because this is not a logical approach to life. As much as we can rationalize and use logic and again, build up our arguments, make it sound strong, it's really not. The abundance and the scarcity, we sort of flip-flop between them, where there's fluidity in which we're like, you know what? Yeah, I don't have a lot of time, but I feel like the world is my oyster. I have all the time in the world, but maybe, in a few years, it won't be like that. So I better do that now. But while I'm in it, I'm going to be fully present and live it up. And it's great and it will never end. And it's just this talk track of illusion, as you said. It's total illusion. And I know it very well from my own experience, because as a 20-year-old and in that stage of life, just what you were talking about, Rasanath, that was my approach, 100%. And I was like ready. We were talking about this earlier today before the podcast. Like I felt ready to conquer the world. I had so much hunger for my immortality projects, and I had them all lined up. I'm going to be like this and this and this. I'm going to make these movies, and I'm going to write these books, and I'm going to have this spouse, and I'm going to have this family, and I'm going to leave all these things behind. But really, I'll never have to leave it behind because I'm always going to be here just eternally enjoying these things. But I know I'm going to die. I know, obviously, I'm going to die, but it's never really going to happen. I don't ever think like it's really going to happen. I know it's going to happen, but come on, we're living it up now. Now is forever.
It's funny, you mentioned your early 20s, and I think the university time, that stage of our life, is actually when a lot of people start to experience either their first full-blown existential crisis, or at least the roots and seeds of their first existential crisis. And there was something that I'm thinking back to my own university days, that it was this mantra of like, we only have 4 years, so we better make the most of these 4 years. And like, you have people who are in their 30s and 40s and even older than that telling you like, these are the best years of your life, so you better take advantage of it. So it really plays into this like mentality of, we have such a limited time, not only as human beings on this earth, but like in this specific situation, and these are the best times ever, and so you better take full advantage of it. The other thing I wanted to share that I feel slightly embarrassed about, but maybe people can relate, is I always had it in my mind. I think in my late teen years, it was like 23. When I get to the age of 23, then I'm going to be at my peak. Like then I'll have my peak physical condition. I'll be earning money. I'll probably be dating a lot of women at that time. Like I just had it in my mind for many years that 23 was going to be my peak. And then when 23 passed, it was 27. And that was the new barometer of the new benchmark of when I would hit my peak, because then I'd have even more earning potential and there'd be more women around and all of these things. And then when 27 passed, it got to be a little bit harder of like, well, now I'm really grasping at straws here. Like, is really 31, is that going to be the new peak? But I've seen it kind of be this rolling thing of never wanting my peak to have passed, because what would that mean? That would mean that I would really have to start looking at death much more in the face.
Right. I am right there with you. I wrote a story that I'll never forget called The Coming of the Age. And it was as like a late teenager looking up to the like early 20s stage where you could legally drink and you would be frequenting the clubs and going out on your own and doing all these things that seemed to be like a sophisticated adult world, but with still youthful vibrancy and so much fun and energy. And it was just, to me, that was ecstasy. I really thought that was ecstasy. And then I reached that stage and I was like, oh, this is totally different from what I thought. This is nothing like what I thought. And so then it's like, well, my life is still ahead of me. There's so much more that I just, I didn't realize that this stage was going to be like this, but the next stage, let me tell you what the next stage is going to be like. So it's constantly projecting into the future. And this goes back to your brilliant piece that you wrote, the freedom fantasy. And what I discovered when I was at this transition point in my early 20s, wanting to conquer the world, but being pulled in a different direction from what I wanted towards a spiritual path. I had come across this work by Milan Kundera, which I've referenced before, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. They made a film out of it as well. And in reading this book, what I got from him was something that would reverberate with me constantly. That we all draw an imaginary line in the future at which time our present problems shall cease to be. He phrases it a little differently, but this was the message. And that message rings in my heart and mind always. And it came exactly when I needed it. to sort of steal me away from the trajectory I was on in a diametrically opposed direction, from the material pursuits into a completely different world of possibility, of transcendence, of wanting to discover the real self. So I found when I read this message that we all draw a line, an imaginary line in the future, at which time our present problems shall cease to be. I felt like, you know what? I'm caught red-handed. I'm doing that as I'm reading. And I have to, as you said, Rasanath, confess. And do I want to just do that for the rest of my life in this compensatory way, living in illusion, and find out that when I'm actually going to die, there is no next imaginary one? Or do I want to live with wisdom? Do I want to live outside the illusion and take a chance, be courageous, do something that flies in the face of what I've been doing my entire life and what I was planning to do for the rest of my life and what I knew everybody around me was?
It's a beautiful example, and thank you for sharing. And this brings us back to that line that an existential crisis is an opportunity for growth. Based on both of what you shared, we spend a lot of time in a coping mechanism so that we don't have to face this truth that we all know buried somewhere within us is actually true. And then we start waking up to the truth of this in some sort of way. Maybe it's a traumatic event like a sickness that we find out about ourselves or a loved one, or some other close encounter with death. And we start to wake up to this. And now we have a choice to make. Do we face it head on and there's the growth? Or do we go back to our normal ways of coping mechanisms so that we don't have to face it so head on?
There is one other flavor of existential crisis. Again, there are many examples that we could talk about in this regard too. But one existential crisis is the existential crisis of success. And the existential crisis of success is I succeed. And then I realize that it doesn't feel like I thought it would.
That's exactly it.
And I put in so much time and effort, and the excitement, this is the crazy part about it. The excitement was all about what it would feel like when I get there. And when I get there, I suddenly realize, well, it actually doesn't. Or even if it does, this is the other part, even if it does, it just lasts for very little time. And then it starts to fade. And then I try to grasp, I try to somehow hold on to it. It just slips through my fingers. And so there's also this added disbelief around, wow, did I spend all my time for that? No, it can't be. I must have missed something. And now what I'm going to do is go back and see what I missed. And I'm going to do that now. Right? I'm going to do this again, but this time it will match up what I thought it would match up. And so the examples that I gave were grave in the sense that they were negative. It all signified some sort of a loss or some deep fear. But the opposite is true too. Even when success comes about, the temporality of it and the letdown around the experience of success brings up the same feeling. I have had at least a few clients who, when I started working with them, had tremendous success. And they wanted to know what's next. But when they approached me, the reason why they wanted to coach was not because they hadn't succeeded. The reason why they wanted to coach was because they were feeling depressed after the success. And I'm laughing because you wouldn't necessarily imagine someone coming for coaching from that place. People usually want to coach because they're experiencing some sort of failure or want to get to some place. But this just gave me confirmation about what I had always experienced personally and I had known, but then to experience a series of examples that were examples of success and then feeling depressed was quite something.
Also, whenever I have anything, I'm constantly afraid of losing. That is the law of this world. And I have to anesthetize myself from that fear so that I can convince myself that I'm enjoying what I have. So I have to then party harder or use other coping mechanisms to keep the fear drowned out so that I can try to stay with the gain that I've just made, and it doesn't work. And this is where you see the lives of successful people, especially this phenomenon, the phenomenon of celebritydom. It's just out of control because there's so much fear and compensation for that fear, and there's no way of processing. So it's very unfortunate. And I brought up on multiple occasions, I always find it so fitting and never, I can never emphasize enough the example of George Harrison, who actually achieved that level of success. And instead of fearing, I mean, he achieved the highest level of success, unbelievable. And instead of fearing he was going to lose it, he made a different decision. He decided, wait a minute, this isn't what I thought. That doesn't mean that I should go and pursue something else, as you were saying, Rasanath, like, oh, well, let me do another material thing really well and get the accolades and swim in the success of that. Instead, he said, there's got to be more to life than these external pursuits. Let me go internal. Let me go internal. That is the most dramatic thing you can possibly do in this world, is make that decision. Let me stop going external and let me go internal.
Thank you for that. It triggered a couple of other points for me around how we cope with an existential crisis, or the idea of an existential crisis. And one way is comedy. And the reason why I bring this up is there's a way in which we make fun of the existential crisis. And even when we talk about an existential crisis, I've seen in many places, oh, the conversation is very existential, huh? And there is almost like a cliche dismissal feeling to, like, oh, so many have talked about this, and it just makes you feel like you are this great philosopher or something, but, just poking fun at it, right?
And it's a badge of honor. Like, it's a badge of honor that you've gone through an existential crisis.
And who are you to solve for this? Come on, this is beyond. You're not going to solve this one. You don't have the answers.
And it's the dark cynicism, right? Around, well, what's the point in talking about that? But to me, I've come to understand that many times cynicism, and to a great degree, skepticism that's not healthy, is basically sophisticated defensiveness. It's well disguised because it comes across as very sophisticated and knowledgeable and practical. But it is the same form of escapism, just finding a very different route, building a very different identity. So that's one other way in which we, on a mass scale, try to cope with the existential angst. And then even when we come to acknowledge the existential crisis, like especially when I talked about success and the crisis of success, that's usually when we see people going into, dare I say, public speaking or philanthropic work. And the basis of that, let me share with you what I have learned from my life. While that can be helpful, when that approach is still a compensation for building a new identity, when the identity of my own success didn't give me what I was really seeking, I'm essentially on the same project. It just takes a very different form.
You're saying the philanthropy is, I'm going to share with you how I achieved success so that I can make you a success.
Or now that I'm successful, let me try and help other people. It can be very easily another, let me now try to, I didn't feel complete after success. Let me try to see if I can use the success to feel more complete through philanthropic work or through, lessons that I learned from my journey towards success and all of that.
That includes even giving away money in charity and so on.
Yes. And last week I was talking to someone about philanthropy, and the co-CEO of this company was just saying how many times the philanthropy is fueled by a dissatisfaction with my success. And while that dissatisfaction is a good one to lean into and explore more deeply, when we use other ways to compensate for it, it just doesn't work.
So existential crisis comes from a fear of death, and it also comes from this fear of not being enough of the identities that are important to me. We always talk about the definition of the word ego at Upbuild as an identity of who we think we should be that is different than who we actually are. And Rasanath, as you're speaking, what's coming to mind are these different identities that I have built for myself and I'm investing in. I want to be successful, so I build a business and then I'm successful, but actually that identity is not satisfying enough. And then I move to a new identity. Okay, so now that I'm successful and I have a bunch of money, now I can give it away and be a philanthropist, or I can be a public speaker and then be some great sage that is sharing all of my wisdom and what I have experienced with other people. But I'm building a new identity in all of these things. And what we find, and the example that you shared, Hari, that is so telling and so deep and impactful, the one of George Harrison, is that even with all of these identities, because they're material identities, they're never actually going to give us what we want.
That's right. Yeah, even as Rasanath was touching on, like, I give away so much money, I'm so good for the world, look at how I'm fueling all these causes and people have me to thank. That doesn't satisfy either. It's still too self-referential and material. And it's, again, coming from this compensation. So then I have nowhere to go. Then I'm really trapped. It's like I've tried everything. The only way to go is internal. And that's a tough one for people. That is a really tough one for people. You also mentioned, Michael, that there are sort of two causes. One is the fear of death, and the other is the fear of not being enough of who I think I should be, which is my ego. Those two are actually the same thing. And the reason is because at the end of the day, what we're afraid of is losing ourself, our core, the real me that I'm striving to be, that I wish I could uncover. And death is a threat to that. And so is not living up in life. And there's also this feeling of, well, once I get there, I never want that to end. If I actually could become who I really am, who I'm actually meant to be, the real me, then that cannot ever end.
Beautiful. I really appreciate this point, how the fear of death and the fear of not being enough of our egos are really the same thing.
Here's the other thing, and we've thought about this a lot. And let's say if there were no death, let's say we just had these eternal bodies, my sense is there would still be a great deal of dissatisfaction when we are still not aligned with who we are. And while, you know, how it can be, we are in this eternal time loop, living in the same body, trying to pursue all that we can pursue. And at the end, we still feel dissatisfied. It's a very different crisis. It feels like you're trapped in this infinite loop. You're living the same, just imagine living the same day every day for the rest of eternity. Even if you get a chance to do a different thing, how different can it be? And at the same time, just recognizing as you keep doing it, wow, this sense of dissatisfaction is so, it's there in me, and I can do nothing to remove that from myself. But that is the deepest level of existential crisis. And it takes honesty to acknowledge that and be able to say, well, why does it exist? What is it pointing towards? And to go to those places does require, as Prasada said, courage. to really look at our lives, to explore paths that would not be, traditional, material paths. This is where, to me, the whole idea of spiritual life, I don't think spiritual life is an option. I think it's a necessity. We just don't get to that place where we truly want to inquire. Or even if we do, we want to inquire from a place of, well, as long as it helps my material identities, I'm good. But it never really addresses this perpetual existential crisis that lives within us.
Well, you just invoked, Rasanath, a grand philosophical debate. And I remember when I was an NYU student, there was a renowned philosopher who was there named Thomas Nagel. He's published a bunch of influential works. And he was involved in one of these debates around, like, are we just unimaginative? If there were no death, are we just unimaginative by thinking that life would get boring? If we could live eternally in these self-same bodies, why would that not be good enough? Or maybe that just feels like, you know what, I would cover all the ground there is to cover, and is it really worth it? Like, do I even want to be eternal in that way? So there is a debate on this subject, but I think what you're pushing for is on one side of the debate that no, it won't be enough. Even if you could try it, it won't be enough because we're so much more than anything we could pursue externally. And going internally is a very different life. And it requires a very different paradigm, which is the transcendent paradigm. That is foreign, provocative, something which asks for us to take a risk and to go into uncharted territory.
Well, one of the reasons why I mentioned what I mentioned was based on what Michael said about, the goalpost being 23, and then, then moving to 27, and then, perhaps at 31. Like, to me, that just indicates that even if I've had to have the abundance of time, the existence of time or the lack of time is not what is creating the dissatisfaction. And that example for me was like, well, okay, I'll give you 10 more years. Will it work? Yes, I'm going to make it work. And and my sense, based on my experience, is that there will still be that, but it just didn't satisfy. Right. So then what?
Yeah, and so it's we don't feel the lack of time, but as Hari mentioned, this fear of death and like having a finite amount of time is actually just the same thing as I'm not going to be enough of my identities, or I'm not getting enough enjoyment or satisfaction, or I'm not achieving the things that I want to achieve yet. And also I want to make sure that this can happen for anyone, not just this does happen for everyone, not just people who are very achievement oriented. So even the person who might enjoy spending a lot of time at home and might be thinking that I'm going inside myself and doing self-discovery, like there can also be a lot of dissatisfaction and ego-based disengagement from the world. It's not all about just going out there and achieving and getting more and more and more. This other person that I'm describing who spends more time at home, like there's a similar thing happening in that person for getting something that they don't have and feeling like I have a finite amount of time to get it. It will look very different on the surface.
This is crucial. We have to be very clear what we're talking about. When we're talking about going external, it doesn't just mean like I'm this ambitious person. I happen to be a very ambitious person. That's my nature. So when I speak from my own experience and when I speak from the experience of what the world pulls us towards, because there's a certain culture of this world, which is achievement oriented. That's different from the sense of I will find my happiness outside of me. The principle is I go out to find my happiness in people, places, and things. You don't have to be with the same nature of an achiever, let's say, to do that. And when we're talking about going internally, even more important, we're not talking about daydreaming. We're not talking about like, oh, I spend a lot of alone time, or I journal, I I have done my journaling for today, or I spent the entire day journaling. I mean, who does that? Wow, what an impressive internal achievement. No, that's not it. When we say going internal, we mean going to the real self, going to the core of my being. And that is not a small thing. It is not a cheap thing. And it is not something which we're accustomed to seeing people do. Introspecting is rare enough in this world. That's a kind of like going closer. It's going more within by introspecting, understanding my thoughts and feelings. Yes, that's directionally good. And we emphasize the need for introspection. But that's not the ultimate. That's not the core. That's not the inner arrival, which George Harrison was after, or which we at Upbuild are in hot pursuit of, and really pleading that all of you listening will take up with spirit. And that requires practices that will help us to uncover the real self, to uncover who we are.
Yeah, so you're preempting it here, but my next question was going to be, what can we do about it? So if we're feeling like we're having an existential crisis, or we've had one in the past, what should we do about it?
Well, the first thing is recognize that if you're not feeling it, it's there. It's there. Try to feel it. Do a little introspection. Go directionally inward. Do a little introspection and see, how am I denying that? How am I compensating for the fact that I'm not living up to who I think I should be, and that time is closing in on me? Then you'll see the existential crisis that is constantly brewing universally in the hearts of every single one of us. And if you get there, then that's a good landmark. That's a really good landmark, because now we're ripe. Now we're primed to do something with the existential crisis. So let that be the starting point. And then from there, what do we do?
To me, and when we use the word spirituality, many times the connotation to spirituality is like, oh, that's the touchy-feely stuff. That's intangible. Talk about the practical world. And to me, the beginning of true spiritual life is the honest acknowledgement that, there is an existential crisis that's brewing. And that takes, as Hari Prasad said, that kind of honesty is rare. But to some degree or other, we have all acknowledged it. The window for how long the acknowledgement lives lasts for very little time. But I think it's very important to go back to that window and say, okay, there is a crisis that I experience. And while I may not necessarily leave the pursuit of what I'm pursuing right now, whether it's a career, relationship, it's so important to not bury the existential crisis through my compensatory actions. I think the call here is to lean into it and ask the bigger questions about life. That's what a seeker is. A seeker is actually seeking answers. It's not a small thing. It takes courage. It takes critical inquiry. It takes to create the time and practices to go deeper and be honest. And in the process, as we learn how to do that, we will also begin to see how the answers emerge. And while the crisis may not immediately be solved, which is what we are looking for, okay, how can somebody take away the crisis? That's not what we are doing. What we are doing is starting the process of returning back to the true self. And in just starting the process, we will experience a sense of relief. I like to say that when we start to walk towards the true self, it's not that there will be no pain. but it is like the pain of recovery versus the pain of an accident. And while in the recovering phase, there is still some pain, we know where it's going. We know that it's actually the pain of getting healing or becoming healed. But the idea here is to step into the discomfort of the existential crisis and create the time, the space, and the honesty to deeply inquire.
There's an entire field called existentialism, and I'm sure our listeners have heard of this. This was a real turning point for me at that stage of turning point, was discovering that field of existentialism. And a lot of the call to awaken is really owing to realizations from that field, starting with its founding father, Søren Kierkegaard. He was the first person to establish what is now known as existentialism. And I want to come back to him in just a moment. But one of his successors, Martin Heidegger, German philosopher who wrote extensively about the meaning of life and what to do with it, he came to one critical conclusion that was not new, but which was new for him and new to a lot of people. And it was definitely new to me when I discovered it, which is in line with what we're talking about from Ernest Becker, that we're shoving death under the rug. So first thing is recognize that. The second thing is realize the opportunity. The crisis being an opportunity for growth is, if I confront my death, then I can master my life. If I confront my death, then the corollary is that I can master my life. This is what sages throughout all ages, from all different traditions, have taught us, that if we confront our death, we will master our life. But that means going deeper. It means finding that part of us which longs to be eternal. And so what Kierkegaard, the founding father of existentialism, the person that got me on this path to spirituality, who is continuing to be a guiding force for me, what he says and what we quote in the session, Checkmate, the Yoga of Existential Crisis from the Call to Awaken, is despair must be regarded as a surpassing excellence. The possibility of this sickness is man's superiority over the animal. And this superiority distinguishes him in quite another way than does his erect walk, for it indicates infinite erectness or sublimity, that he is spirit. Once more, despair must be regarded as a surpassing excellence. The possibility of this sickness is man's superiority over the animal, and this superiority distinguishes him in quite another way than does his erect walk, for it indicates infinite erectness or sublimity, that he is spirit. So existential crisis is an opportunity for growth. It's the chance to get in touch with who we really are, the spirit, the transcendent core of our being that cannot conceive of death and that need not deny death, because that death has nothing to do with itself.
Beautiful. Thank you both. So just to anchor some of these points, we are all having an existential crisis at all times. It's just that we may be more attuned to it at certain times in our life, or there might be people who are more attuned to it than other people. But if we're not feeling like we're having an existential crisis, well, then we're not looking hard enough. And what we can do to see that is to really go inside and also to contemplate our own death. Because like you said, Hari, if I can confront my own death, then I can master my life. And so we actually want to walk toward the existential crisis. We want to view it as something that's happening for our own benefit. It's actually not something to run away from. It's not something to be fearful of. It's the reality of what we're experiencing, of the truth of our being. And so by walking toward it, it's actually an unbelievable opportunity to grow and to get closer to the real self.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much, Michael. I'm so inspired by the way that you have just recapitulated, because this is the heart of it all. This is what we really need and what we stand to gain, like anything, if we take it to heart.
And there are 3 Ps, Hari, that your guru, Satchidananda Swami, will often share with us for ways to really nourish our spiritual practices, which can lead us through an existential crisis. And those 3s are people, philosophy, and practice. So people, we need to be in community with others who are like-minded, who are also seeking answers to the deep questions of life. We need to learn to read sacred texts or take courses, listen to people who are well in front of us on this path, and understand the knowledge and information that they have. So that's the philosophy part of it. And the final part is practice, where we're actually doing meditation or going inside in some way that will help nourish ourselves spiritually.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Yeah, this is it. And I mean, what transformation will take place through confronting our existential crisis and acting in line with the real self through what you talked about, the 3 Ps of people, practice, and philosophy. That transformation is beyond our wildest imagination. And it really is unending.
Beautiful. Rasanath, anything you would share in closing?
No, I think I feel complete.
Okay.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Well, thank you both for your energy, your time, your wisdom, as always. Also for creating the course, The Call to Awaken. I'm so excited for it to restart again. I've been through the course a couple of times, but there's new insights every time it comes. And to also be with a fresh cohort of people who are really looking to find answers to their own questions. And so thank you for that. And again, for this episode, it's such a joy to be spending this time with both of you.
Thank you,
Right
Michael.
there with you. So beautiful to be in this connection with you and to be able to try to offer something to our listeners. And I can't wait for the Call to Awaken as well. This really got my juices flowing. And yeah, I can't wait for what more is to come.
Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you for listening to Upbuilding the Self. Upbuild is a leadership development company that offers workshops, coaching, and other services to help you on the path towards being your best self, free from the shackles of the ego. To learn more about our work, visit our website, upbuild.com, and sign up for our newsletter to gain access to podcasts, reflections, and upcoming events. If you enjoyed this episode, please go to iTunes to leave us a review so that others can find and benefit from the podcast. We look forward to being with you again next time.